Okay, hi everybody. We're going to talk about Judith Butler's piece on performativity today. If this text seemed very difficult to you, don't worry. It is a difficult text. Not only are the concepts and the philosophical ideas here difficult, but Butler's writing itself is obscure. Butler has a very rhetorical writing style which makes already difficult ideas even more difficult to understand. So hopefully this video will help you to at least flesh out some of the main ideas from Butler's text. Butler's thesis here is generally that gender identity is constituted through what she calls a stylized repetition of acts. So gender identity is a performative accomplishment that is enforced by social norms, and thus it can be differently constituted. So there's a descriptive aspect to this text, and there is a prescriptive aspect. So she's arguing that gender identity is performative, it's socially constructed in a sense, it's not essential. We heard this from Beauvoir, but further, on the prescriptive side, that it can be constituted differently. Following Beauvoir, Butler describes how Beauvoir invokes a kind of phenomenological approach in thinking about what it means to be a woman. When Beauvoir claims that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, she invokes this notion or this kind of meaning of act. Hi, Lexi. Oh, hi. Oh, hi. I love you. You want to do some gender theory? Yeah? Are you thinking about gender theory? Yeah. As I was saying, Beauvoir takes a kind of phenomenological approach in thinking about gender performance. Phenomenology is the study of first-person conscious experience. It's a broad philosophical approach to thinking about the world and our lives and our existence from our first-person experience. How do we experience the world? Rather than discussing what exists, what we can know from some kind of universal or third-person perspective, phenomenology investigates the ways in which we experience the world. So the phenomenological understanding of an act, unlike the understanding of an act in moral theory or in philosophy of language or linguistics, the phenomenological understanding of an act is the social agent's constitution of reality through social signs such as language, gesture, possibly clothing. So gender, on Beauvoir's view, is not a stable or essential aspect of identity. We talked about how Beauvoir de-essentializes gender, and Butler is going to sort of take Beauvoir's position as a starting point and take it a little further, but she agrees that gender is instituted socially through a kind of stylized repetition of acts. So the appearance of substance is a kind of performative accomplishment, even though it's believed to be real. So although gender appears to be some real, essential, existing thing, it's not at all real. It's simply a performative accomplishment. And without the performance of gender, there would be no gender. For this reason, the transformation of gender relations, on Butler's view, will be found in breaking the repetition of the style that's being performed currently. So there's a possibility of undermining the current script of gender performance. And so one of Butler's tasks in this and other texts is to show how gender is constituted through performance and how it can be differently constituted through performance. For Butler, constituting acts constitute the identity of the actor and constituting acts constitute the illusion of the actor's identity as a belief in some essential gender. So performative acts constitute an identity for the actor, and performative acts constitute the illusion that that actor's identity is real, that there is some essential gender. Now, Butler says that feminist theory has in fact been critical of the sex-gender system, and again we saw this in Beauvoir, which assumes that sex determines gender. And similarly, phenomenological theories have been critical of the distinction between biological causality and the meanings ascribed to biological existence or bodily existence. So, for example, phenomenological theories have been critical of things like placing a meaning like gender or other social meanings onto a kind of biologically caused reality. So saying that a certain kind of biological body made up of certain chemicals, certain hormones, certain body parts is correlated with a certain social meaning is problematic from a phenomenological perspective. So Beauvoir relies on both feminist theory and phenomenology, claiming that woman is not a natural fact, but woman is a becoming. Woman is an historical situation. So in the case of Beauvoir and phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty, the materiality of the body is not itself denied, but what is challenged is the meanings that are socially ascribed on the body. That there is some essential relationship between meanings like gender and gender identity and biological facticity, the body itself. Yet this understanding should be expanded, Butler thinks, to show that acts not only constitute meaning, but they are also that through which meaning is enacted. So in this text, and more so in later texts, Butler's going to talk about the ways in which the body itself, the matter that matters, is actually constituted through performative acts. So gender is constructed through corporeal acts, and thus it's through these acts, these bodily corporeal acts, that the culture of gender can be transformed. For Butler, the body is a set of possibilities. The appearance of the body is not predetermined by some essence, biological, linguistic, or otherwise. The body's expression is a specific iteration of historical possibilities. The body's expression is a specific iteration of historical and therefore contingent possibilities. So the body is not just matter. The body is not merely brute matter, but a continuous materializing of possibilities through particular acts shaped by the historical contingent moment or milieu. Thus, one is not a body. One does one's body. So performativity theory is concerned with the way one constitutes oneself. On Butler's view, there is no given. One is not a pre-given body. But one becomes, one does one's body. One does one's gender identity. There is no I, no agency, no self, prior to and separate from the performative acts, the constituting body. As Beauvoir argued, the body is an historical situation and it reproduces a historical situation through its acts. So we show up in a particular social, historical, cultural situation, and through performative acts, we reproduce that historical situation. For Butler, the doing of gender, the performativity of gender, requires a style of being that is never fully self-styled. It is historically contingent. And gender is a performative act that is both intentional and at the same time, a historical and material process. For Beauvoir, to be female is to have a biological facticity without meaning. But to be a woman is to have become a woman. To conform to the contingent historical understanding of woman, it is to become a kind of cultural sign, repeatedly materializing oneself obediently to the historical possibilities. And this happens not so much out of a sense of agency, Butler argues, but out of a sense of duress. On Butler's view, this is a kind of survival strategy. Because those who fail to do their genders right or appropriately are regularly punished. And this is a reality. The rape and murder of those who fail to appropriately perform their gender is quite common. Not only in the past, but still today. And seemingly insignificant punishments like hate speech, jokes, and social rejections are a reality for people who fail to appropriately perform their gender. Charlie Howard was drowned for being flamboyantly gay. Lawrence King was shot by a classmate. Carl Joseph Walker Hoover hanged himself at 11 years of age because he was being bullied for being gay. Ronnie Paris, a 3-year-old little boy, was killed by his father, who was concerned that he would grow up to be gay because he was acting like a sissy. Andrew Anthos, a 72-year-old disabled man, who was beaten with a lead pipe in Detroit. The numerous black trans women who have been murdered. Kendall Hampton, Deja Jones, Dana Larkin, Letitia Green, Stacey Brown, Duana Johnson, Tracy Johnson, Nisa Morris, Victoria White, just a few of the many black trans women murdered because of gender performance. Brandon Teena, the motivation for the movie Boys Don't Cry, starring Hilary Swank. Harvey Milk, Matthew Shepard. Just a few of the many punishments for failing to perform gender in accordance with prescribed gender norms. Gender is not an essence. It is not a normative ideal. Gender acts create the idea of gender, and thus the construction of gender mystifies its own creation. There's a tacit agreement that persons will perform and maintain the gender binary as a cultural fiction. And this cultural fiction is mystified by the believability of its production through gender acts. So we become convinced by our own performance, and we believe gender to be real. Reality is an ontological issue. Whether or not gender is real is a question about what we mean by reality. On Butler's view, gender is not real. Gender is a performance that causes the belief in the reality or essence of gender. Ontologically, Butler, along with Beauvoir, will argue that gender is not ontologically real. It's not essentially real. It's a social construct. It doesn't really exist. According to feminist theory, subjective experience is structured by social, historical, and political situations. And social, historical, and political situations are also structured by subjective experience. This is the notion that's behind the mantra, the feminist mantra, the personal is political. So, although my acts are mine, they reproduce the situation of my gender. In the mantra, the personal political, there is this latent supposition that the life world of gender relations is constituted, at least partially, through concrete and historically mediated acts, yet it can only be known through its gendered appearance. So the gendered body is merely a legacy of sedimented acts. It's not a predetermined fact. It's not a real, ontological, substantively existing essence. Gender is not real. And on Butler's view, in order to transform the social situation of women, it must be determined whether the category of women is, by definition, to be in an oppressed situation. That is, given the category women, which is a non-real, socially constructed category, is it necessary that that category of persons is in an oppressed situation? So feminist discourse often relies on a kind of universal category of women. We saw this in Marilyn Frye's account of gender oppression. And this universalizing category gives a false impression of a kind of political solidarity, while also giving the impression that women's concrete lives can be represented by their inclusion in some universal category. Butler is going to challenge this, and some of the texts that we'll look at in the second section on race and subjectivity will also challenge this notion that women's concrete lives can be represented merely by their inclusion in a socially constructed category. So if gender has cultural significance through these performative, stylized acts and through the cultural perception of these performed acts, then it's not possible to know one's sex as distinct from one's gender. That there is a natural sex appears to be true, but like gender, it is nothing more than a reified fiction. When we look at the reading by Fausto Sterling next Monday, which correlates with the film XXY, which you should watch over the weekend, we will further question the notion of sex as a given, predetermined category. So Butler argues that a given culture is reproduced through its mode of sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction in our culture is instituted through the institution of heterosexuality, which associates a kind of natural sex, male and female, with a set of gender roles, man and woman, which include the appropriate object of sexual attraction. It's normatively ideal that women are attracted to men and men are attracted to women. But why? We live in a society that is structured around the institution of heterosexuality. There's some really interesting work on this. I typically assign the Gail Rubin reading as the first text in this course, but given time constraints, we didn't read Gail Rubin, but Butler touches on some of Gail Rubin's main points. So Gail Rubin is an anthropologist, and she pulls in, among others, Claude Lévi-Strauss and Marx and Engels to talk about how societies regulate and reproduce kinship bonds. So the ways in which society is structured, who lives with whom, who's related to who is allowed to love who is given as a gift to whom. All of these are historical and contingent aspects of culture. In Rubin's text, The Traffic in Women, she discusses the way in which gift-giving and the incest taboo produce the system of compulsory heterosexuality, and further identifies how gender identity is a trace of kinship structures. So for Rubin, there's this notion of gift-giving. There's a history of the construction of kinship, that is, relations among people, in which women were given as gifts by men to other men. This gift-giving practice allowed for families to bond with other families, primarily men to bond with other men, by giving their women away. And this is related to the incest taboo because Rubin argues that the incest taboo is not in place to prevent deformities. In fact, even though most societies have an incest taboo, the incest taboo is actually different in each society. In some societies, it's normatively ideal if you marry a cousin. In some societies, it's normatively ideal if you marry your father's best friend, etc., etc. So even though there is a kind of incest taboo, the rules are different in every society. So the rules are contingent. And so the incest taboo works in such a way as not to prevent the birth of babies with disabilities or deformities, but in fact, it's put in place in order to structure relationships among men. By instituting an incest taboo and saying that women can only marry outside of the family, it allows men to give away women as gifts. And although we see this explicitly today, there are still practices that are reminiscent of the practice of gift giving. And that is, in traditional weddings, the man gives away his daughter. You might have wondered why that's a practice. Well, it's a residue of a time when women were literally gifted to other men in order to create strong bonds among males and heads of household for their own privilege and power. Women's choice in the matter was not an issue. So, since sex, gender, and heterosexuality are historical products of kinship relations, the ways in which we relate to other people, and that is socially contingent, historically contingent, these practices have become reified, that is, concretized, put into place in such a way that we don't question them, we think that's just the way it is, and they've been mystified. We don't even see them as contingent practices, we see them as reality, the only option, just the way things are, as nature, as given. Yet it's not clear that sex, gender, and heterosexuality are in any way given. In fact, Butler and others that we will read in this course will argue just the opposite. Gender, sex, and heterosexuality are contingent ways of being. They're not given. They're not natural or essential. They're no more natural or essential than any other way of being. On Butler's view, phenomenology offers us a kind of a good starting point, since it allows us to have an understanding of the body as a mode of enacting gender identity. So gender identity is enacted through bodily acts. However, it's not clear how to conceptualize the character of gender oppression from a phenomenological approach. And the reason is that individual acts shape social conditions and produce and maintain oppressive conditions, but individual acts are only possible, they're only conceivable as acts, individual acts, within a given social context. So you might think of, for example, say RuPaul's drag show. So RuPaul started this television show. It's a reality show where he has on drag queens and they compete to win a prize by performing their drag. In some ways, these performances, although Butler will draw a distinction between performance as entertainment and performance as constituting gender identity, the performance of the drag queens on RuPaul's Drag Race is not something that was possible outside of the context in which it became enacted. For example, it's not as if in 1910, had RuPaul been alive and had he been the person that he was, that RuPaul could have started a reality show called RuPaul's Drag Race. Certain actions enacting our gender identities in particular ways only shows up as a possibility within an already existing social and historical context or social and historical situation. So transforming social relations can't simply be a matter of changing individual actions. Well, if I just perform my gender subversively, then I can change gender oppression. Butler's saying, no, actually, it's a matter of transforming hegemonic, dominant social conditions. But you might say, well, wait a second. Butler's whole point was that gender is something that we perform through individual acts. And that's true. Yet, On Butler's view, performative acts are not individual. They're shared and collective. So in the same way that the feminist mantra, the personal is political or structural, the act, the performative act, is collective in that it, as Butler says, it wears a certain cultural signification. So one always does one's gender in accordance with cultural sanctions and significations, never in isolation. One's performances are not just something that an individual does. They are cultural and social significations. Otherwise, there would be no reason to do gender. We do gender so that others collectively can read the gender that we're doing. An act has already been rehearsed in much the same way as a script for a movie precedes the actors that read the script for the movie. So an act has been rehearsed by someone else. It's already available in the same way that a script is available to an actor who reads the script for some particular movie. Although individual bodies enact gender significations, the action itself is public, so there are always temporal and cultural dimensions, and those dimensions are collective. So in this way, gender is not really a radical project or some individual choice. Yet, at the same time, it's not merely imposed upon the individual. I don't just wake up one day and say, I don't want to be part of the gender binary. I am just going to perform my gender in a different way. Well, however I decide to perform my gender, it's wrapped up in, it's necessarily enmeshed in the cultural significations and meanings that are available to me for my individual actions. At the same time, it's not as if I just sit here idly by while society inscribes a gender on me. You're a man, you're a woman, and that's the end of the story. So actors are already on the stage, so to speak. We're already in a particular social and historical milieu, but the script can be enacted in particular ways by particular actors. The play actually requires this. Although the script precedes the actor's reading of the script, the play itself requires a particular reading of the script. So the actor acts in accordance with the confines of the script, yet in a particular way, a stylization. Leaving behind the theater metaphor, gender performances are policed and punishable. Of course, if we're looking at performance as entertainment, we can say, that was a good movie, that was a bad movie. But if we're talking about performance as the constitution of gender, gender performances are policed and punishable. The trans person on stage might be entertaining, but the trans person sitting next to us on the bus or in the library can compel feelings of fear or feelings of violence, as we saw in mentioning just a few of the folks who have been murdered due to their gender performance. The act as entertainment can be derealized, whereas the performative act cannot be disentangled from one's reality. In fact, it constitutes a reality that cannot be easily accommodated given the depth of people's belief in the ontological realness of the binary sex-gender system. With the act as entertainment, whether you're watching a drag show or a movie that has cross-dressing in it, or someone is, for entertainment purposes, acting outside appropriate gender categories, one is capable of taking that lightly and saying, well, that's funny. That boy is playing a girl, and that's funny because that boy is not supposed to be a girl. He's really a boy. But with the act as constitutive of reality, of gender itself, there is no accommodation within the binary sex-gender system. And this is threatening to people who hold deep beliefs in that binary system. So the trans person challenges the sex-gender binary itself and further challenges the distinction between appearance and reality. If the reality of gender is constituted by performance, not constituted as some given, then there is no essential sex or gender that is being expressed. So Butler is denying a politics of expression and replacing that with a politics of performativity. So the gender of any trans person is as real as the gender of any law-abiding, sex-gender, binary accommodating person. Because gender is not given. It's merely performed. Gender is constituted through a stylized performance. So gender reality just is performative. Gender is real only to the extent that it's performed. If it were not performed, it wouldn't be real. So the performance creates the reality through a psychological interiority, which becomes the fiction of gender in people's belief systems. There is no core identity that is expressed through acts. It's not as if I have an identity inside me, and when I act, I express that identity. There is no core gender identity that is the correlate of biological sex. Gender is not a role that expresses an interior self, whether the self is understood as sexed or not. Genders can be neither true nor false, real nor apparent. Yet those who fail to perform the illusion of gender are punished, which in and of itself should reveal the fiction of the realness of gender. So on Butler's view, this account of gender as performativity, is necessary for a political response to gender oppression. Now, it may be worrisome, and it is to some feminists, to claim that women do not exist as such, that gender is not real. However, on Butler's view, essentializing sexual difference reifies sexual difference as culturally necessary, precluding an analysis of how it is constituted and thus precluding liberation. So a politics of performativity both redescribes gender identities and offers a prescriptive view about the kind of gender reality there ought to be. The prescription is difficult because we want to think of a world where acts and gestures and clothing express nothing. But that's very difficult to do. I mean, try to think about that. Try to think of a world where someone's actions, their gestures, their clothing, what we take to be their gender presentation, doesn't actually express something about their core identity. The prescriptive view also requires revealing the reifications and mystifications of what are taken to be essential gender identities. And it also requires an acknowledgement of the complexity of gender without the policing and punishment of gender performances. So for Butler, women should be represented in a way that does not distort and reify the collectivity of persons the theory is meant to liberate. That is, when women are represented as a universal category, that universal category reifies women as having an essential and given gender identity. And thus, it's impossible to liberate women if we're constantly reifying the fact that they have a core gender identity. Feminist theory improves on the traditions of humanist discourse, where the universal person is seen as male, this idea that Beauvoir was undermining. Yet, to reify sexual difference preserves that binary restriction on gender identity, and it maintains a heterosexual framework for gender and sexuality. Particular women are harmed by these reifications. So there's nothing about a binary gender system that is given. Gender is performative, and it's not passively scripted on the body, although there are strict punishments for contesting the script. And gender is enacted daily, with anxiety and with pleasure, but it's neither a natural nor a linguistic given. Gender is a performative constitution. Gender is performatively constituted through individual yet collective stylized acts.